I just know that there was nobody better. No, but this man on the planet is me. I pray that we'll forever be on and on and on and on and on. Let's go on and on and on and on. Bring out the playful side in me, and the clown will never go around. Oh, the tone of your voice, the frequency, I can't think of a more pleasant sound. You got me thinking about you ever, baby. I'm changing from the inside out. And at the end of my day, I look around, wanna see that you are still here with me, yeah. On and on, and we go on and 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 side by side, everything close to me, comfortable, yeah. Oh, won't you let me, baby, be your shelter? Oh, I prayed and I do my part. Oh, show you that I can bear, that I'll always be here. I'll always be here. Oh, and
meeting you with a view to a kill, place to place in secret places, feel the chill. that more covers me. But you know the plans I'm making still overseas. Could it be the whole earth opening wide? A sacred wine, a mystery gaping inside. The weekend's wide until we dance into the fire. The fatal kiss is only me. Dance into the fire. The fatal sounds, broken dreams. Dance into the fire. The fatal kiss is only me. Dance into the fire. Choice for you is the view to make it between the shades, assassination, standing still. There's crystal tear, fall of snowflake, first time in years. To drench your skin with lover's rosy stain. A chance to find the phoenix on a plane. A chance to die, but can we dance into the fire? The fatal kiss is only me. Dance into the fire.
Sentite? Sentite? So, shall we start? So, sì, cioè, devo parlare più vicino? Ok. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bergamo. I'm Silvia Spattini. I'm the director, and it's a pleasure and an honor for me to open this ADAPT's 11th international conference dedicated to work and its value. And despite the persistent pandemic and the worsening of the situation in many countries, it's a pleasure in any case to welcome you here in Bergamo and host more than 130 participants from over 20 countries, and for this 3 days event with 3 plenary sessions and 9 thematic workshops. 12 years ago, we, as ADAPT, we started to investigate the great transformation of work, and among other activities, we started a series of international conferences. ADAPT has committed to increase the awareness that work has been challenged by major changes, not only in technology and economy, but also in demography, in climate and environment. And lastly, COVID-19 has imposed relevant changes on our life, our work, and the way we work and the way we can work. Obviously, this has led us to rethink the approach to work. And since the Industrial Revolution, work and its value are always being considered mostly in terms of economic exchange. The principle of remuneration in exchange for work still governs the labor market. However, today it's important to understand whether work can be still seen as a mere exchange relationship. It seems that today's labor markets characterized by frequent translation, workers' motivations and expectation are becoming or have become a more and more relevant aspect and to go beyond the economic dimension. Traditional categories in many disciplines investigating work are based on the idea of 20th century worker, and they are still wide used, but probably they are not longer suitable to framework changes and work transitions and to describe the new way of performing work. So considering this background, I tried to sketch in very few sentences that we decided to dedicate this international conference to rethink in an interdisciplinary perspective the value of work, and so invited to provide a contribution for the conference. So selected contribution will be presented in these 3 days. So before the end of this brief welcome remarks, I would like to express our thanks to some institutions and the people who helped make the event possible. So let me thank the International Labour Organization for renewing the partnership in the organization of this conference. And we also could count on the collaboration of Cielo Laboral Network. And we count also in on the support of the World Employment Confederation that sustain for many years our international conference. And we would like also to thank for the support Intesa San Paolo e l'ente bilaterale territoriale del terziario di Bergamo that sustained too for many years our international conferences. And we are also proud that the conference obtained the auspices of the lower house of Parliament, the Presidency of Council of Ministers, the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies, the Italian Institution for Insurance Against Accidents at Work, and the Italian Institute of Social Security, and the municipality of Bergamo. I would also, I would like also to thank very much all the ADAPS colleagues for the organization of the conference. And let me also thank the interpreter for the work they will do these days. We really hope that this is going to be a great opportunity for a very fruitful discussion and exchange of ideas. So many thanks to all speakers, to all and each of you, and to also to people following the live stream. And so thank you indeed for coming and for following us. I wish you an interesting 3-day event and experience. So now we enter really the conference. I leave the floor to colleagues Lili Casano and Emanuele Dagnino, who will introduce the speakers of this plenary session and chair the first session. So thank you. And please.
Thank you, Silvia. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We are very pleased to open this first plenary session of the International Conference Work and its Values Interdisciplinary Reflection on a Never-Changing Concept. And first of all, we want obviously to thank our guests, Professor Streeck and Professor Ruth Dukes, for being here today and break the ice of these 3 days of speeches, debates, and reflections over the value of work today. In particular, they will help us to trace the general coordinates for the reflection that we will carry out in the next 2 days. Obviously, any reflection on this challenging topic cannot be separated from a deep analysis of the context in which today work and its value or better values are conceived. Simply said, we cannot We cannot understand work and its values without framing these concepts in the context of capitalism and following Professor Streeck, capitalist society. For this reason, we are particularly grateful to our guests for agreeing to bring to our conference their studies on the tensions to which labor law is labor regulation is exposed in the frame of neoliberal capitalism. Through today's interventions and the debate that will follow, we will therefore try to lay the foundations for our exchanges on the value of work, even beyond the dimension of market exchange, starting from a greater awareness of the variables and constants in the relationships between economic and social dimensions in the capitalist society. So the interventions of our guests will guide us in a reflection on the relationship between state and market, between status and contract, for how these have traditionally they have been traditionally conceived in the golden age of labor market regulation, and for how they are conceived in a context marked by neoliberalism, in which we are witnessing what the speakers themselves have elsewhere defined a polarization of status and contract, resulting in a dualism between a core of workers with job security and employment rights, and a periphery of casualized and highly precarious labor. A polarization that today, after the tragic experience of the pandemic, seems less sustainable than ever, and urgently asks for a recomposition of interests in a new idea of justice. This line of reasoning will lead us to question and assess what is the role of the law, and namely of labor law, in guaranteeing this idea of justice, considering the relations between the law in the book and the law in action.
So there is certainly no need to introduce our outstanding guests to the audience, but it is anyway appropriate to say a few words of presentation. Professor Dukes is professor of labor law at the University of Glasgow, where she is also the principal investigator of the ERC-funded project Work on Demand, Contracting for Work in a Changing Economy. She is a member of a number of scientific committees, both of scientific associations and organizations, and of national and international journals. Among the different scientific appointments, let me say that she is a member of the ADAPT International Scientific Committee. Her research interests, which spaces in the field of labor law widely intended, are particularly focused on collective labor law, that she analyzed both with reference to the current legal system and with reference to its foundations in the scholarship of the discipline such as Hugo Sinsheimer and Otto Kampfreund. Her current research agenda deals with the evolving nature of contracts and contracting behavior in the context of the Work on Demand project, and on the relationship between informal norms of industrial justice as generated by workers in occupational communities and formal norms in labor law, issue analyzed in a related project along with Professor Streeck. Professor Streeck is Emeritus Director at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, where he served as a director until retirement in 2014. He has previously been Professor of Sociology and Industrial Relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been a member of several scientific committees and also served as an expert in public commissions. He received many honors for his scientific and public contribution. His scholarship ranges extensively in the field of sociology and industrial relations, and the list of his publications is overwhelming and continuously increasing. He is currently involved in two projects, the one already mentioned together with Professor Dukes and regarding social and legal norms, and the other focused on the crisis of contemporary capitalism. So our panel will start with the presentation of Professor Dukes, who will share her reflections on labor law and neoliberalism. We will then have time for a first discussion. After this first exchange, we will move to the presentation of Prof. Streeck on industrial justice in a conflictual and dynamic society, also followed by discussion and by a break. The second part of our session will be dedicated to a reflection on labor research methods, and starting from the methodological proposals by Prof. Dukes and Streeck in a recent contribution, we asked to our guests, and they kindly accepted, to discuss this proposal with us. And here we particularly look at the young researchers and PhD students from ADAPT School. But we are aware and we are sure that these reflections meet the general interest and curiosity of the whole audience. So Professor Dukes will now take the floor and will prepare your presentation here. Thank you. Where you prefer? Okay.
So thank you. Thank you for that very helpful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you to all of you for your time and for your attention. In this lecture, I consider the hallmarks of law, and especially labour law, at a time of neoliberalism. I use the UK as a case study, and I juxtapose two somewhat stylized accounts of labour law in the shorter 20th century and labour law today. By shorter 20th century, I mean, roughly speaking, from the end of the First World War until the election of the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher in 1979. The Conservatives are, of course, the centre-right party in the UK. In each case, I'll say something about the respective roles of states and markets in the field of work and work relations, about the rule of law, and thirdly, about contract and freedom. A basic definition of rule of law, I mean, to begin with anyway, I'll say more about it as I go, but a basic definition, the principle that society is governed by legal rules. So along the way, I'll take the opportunity to present some findings from the research project that Manuele already mentioned. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors before I do so. So for much of the short 20th century, it was public policy in the UK to encourage workers to join trade unions and to encourage employers to bargain collectively with the unions. Sector-wide collective agreements were recognised to take wages out of competition, which was thought to be a good thing. For as long as policy was informed by Keynesian economics, unions and collective bargaining were also valued for their capacity to raise wages, increasing workers' spending power and stimulating demand, provided, of course, that wages didn't get so high as to cause inflation. Unions and collective bargaining were valued too as a means of addressing poverty and casualisation. The peculiarly British system of labour law in place for much of the 20th century was often described as voluntarist, the role of the state as abstentionist. The leading labour law scholar Otto Kahn-Freund used the label collective laissez-faire, suggesting that the state preferred to leave it to the collective parties to regulate industrial relations and terms and conditions of employment. They did this through collective bargaining, collective arbitration, and if it came to it, through industrial action. In these ways, trade unions and management bore primary responsibility for creating and enforcing the rules that regulated wages and other aspects of work relations. If the notion of collective laissez-faire implied a certain neutrality on the part of the state when it came to the substance of these rules, it was certainly not intended to imply state neutrality on the question of the desirability of collective rule setting and enforcement. From the time of the First World War until 1979, a variety of means were employed by the state to promote unionization and collective bargaining. In time, the 1945 election manifesto of the Labour Party proved to be definitive of what came to be known as the post-war consensus in British politics. In that manifesto, the objective was made quite explicit of emancipating working people by placing restrictions on market freedoms. So I'm quoting now from the manifesto of 1945. The anti-controllers and anti-planners desire to sweep away public controls simply in order to give the profiteering interests and the privileged rich an entirely free hand to plunder the rest of the nation as shamelessly as they did in the 1920s. Does freedom for the profiteer mean freedom for the ordinary man and woman? There are certain so-called freedoms that Labour will not tolerate. Freedom to exploit other people, freedom to pay poor wages and to push up prices for selfish profit, freedom to deprive the people of the means of living full, happy, healthy lives. Well, election manifestos don't read like that anymore, perhaps unfortunately. But the point that I'm making by quoting from that manifesto is that it was not understood in 1945 and in the post-war decades that greater freedom for working people had to be purchased at the cost of lesser economic efficiency and economic growth. As part of a swathe of government actions intended to stimulate demand, trade unions and collective bargaining were cast as beneficial too from an economic point of view. Good for freedom, good for the economy. How did the principle of the rule of law figure in this voluntarist system? The first point of interest here is the existence of fairly widespread agreement, or at least loudly declared opinion, that the law should stay out of industrial relations. Under UK law, the collective agreement was understood to be a gentleman's agreement rather than a contract, binding in honour only and not as a matter of law. Its breach by either side might well result in industrial sanctions, including strikes and lockouts. But there could be no legal action for breach of a collective agreement and no legal remedy. I'm oversimplifying here a little, but the basic point is true. Even under this so-called voluntarist system, however, collectively agreed norms were morally binding, meaning that they had something like the force of law. There were rules, these were of general application, and they were mostly respected by the affected parties. British industrial relations was accordingly understood to be rule-bound and ordered, mature, as Kant Freund put it, writing in 1957. Did the rule of law provide legitimation of the system in that case? I believe it did. Indeed, it was precisely a perception of the breakdown of the post-war rule-based order in the late 1960s, which eventually led to rather sweeping legislative change in 1971. Of course, the notion was also important in terms of legitimation, that the collectivist system was democratic in nature. It was democratic because it involved workers through their unions in the setting and enforcement of the rules that governed their working relations and working lives. So I think this was a particular understanding of the rule of law, which ties the notion of law to democratically passed laws, democratically set laws. How did contract figure in the British voluntarist system? According to Conflictual, the contract of employment was the cornerstone of the whole system of labour law. This was because, in the eyes of the law, at least, it was the agreement of a contract which created an employment relationship. It was the contract which constituted the two parties as an employer and employee, with certain legal rights enjoyed and obligations owed accordingly. In the British case, this included, first and foremost, the collectively negotiated rules found in the collective agreement. Once you, as a worker, had agreed a contract with an employer, the rules of the relevant collective agreement applied to you and to it. In addition to being contractual relations, work relations were recognized by scholars like Conflictual to be relations of subordination. It followed that contract was necessary, but not sufficient to protect the rights and interests of workers. If contract was to deliver on its implied promise to offer both parties real freedom of choice, it must be supplemented by protective employment laws and collective relations between unions, works councils, where there were such, and employers. This is a really key idea, I think, in 20th century labour law. The contract is understood to be necessary, but not sufficient when it comes to securing freedom for workers as well as for employers. So what about today? In contrast to the post-war system, the field of work relations and labour law today may be characterised with reference to the weakened state of trade unions and the relative insignificance of collective bargaining. Collective agreements still exist, of course, in the UK, but they apply only to a minority of workers, mostly public sector workers, and they're much thinner in substance than they used to be, regulating fewer elements of work relations. Labour law no longer supports trade unionisation and collective bargaining as it used to do. It neither requires companies to negotiate with unions, nor does it even encourage them to do so as it did in the 20th century. Instead, labour law, has been used to curtail the freedom of unions, especially the freedom to organise industrial action, but also union freedoms to manage their own affairs, their own relations with their members, and so on. Law has also been used to empower individual union members against their own union and to empower employers against the unions. A second key transformation of labour law in the intervening decades has been the use of statute to create individual rights for workers. For example, a legal right to a minimum wage, to maternity and paternity leave and pay, to paid holidays and breaks. Individual employment rights of this type began to be introduced in the 1960s, but initially only very gradually, and then much more quickly in the late 1990s and early 2000s under the Labour government and Prime Minister Tony Blair, partly as a result of the Labour government signing up to the social protocol of the Maastricht Treaty. Notwithstanding these statutory rights, it's nonetheless clear that the rhetoric and the idea of free markets continue to shape government policy in the field of work relations and labour law. And that's almost equally true of the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as of the Conservative governments of recent years. Especially from the late 1980s, the notion of free markets has been used to justify successive waves of anti-trade union legislation. And it has also been used to justify the weakening of individual employment rights, cast especially by the Conservatives as unnecessary red tape. By Tony Blair's Labour government, the notion of free markets was used to explain why no steps would be taken by them to restore trade union rights to take industrial action. And it was used to explain why new individual employment rights would provide minimum protections only, with the new minimum wage set, for example, at a level below the cost of living. In 1998, Tony Blair famously boasted that even after the new government reforms, the UK would have the most lightly regulated labour market of any European state. To what extent, if at all, does this flexibility imperative and the ambition to free markets undermine the rule of law? Doesn't it imply rather that individual companies can do as they like? What I would like to suggest here is that law still plays a legitimizing role, but now through its provision of basic minimum rights, and secondly, through the legal institution of contract. So let me say a little more about both of these points. On paper, employees in the UK enjoy a fairly wide range of employment rights. A first thing to note, however, is that many of these rights apply only to employees in the narrow legal sense of that term, meaning that they don't apply to agency workers and to various types of casual worker. Some employment rights additionally come with a minimum length of service requirement, which can be as long as 2 years. So for example, there is no right under UK law not to be unfairly dismissed until you have been in continuous employment with the same employer for 2 years. Even for employees who have been in post for the requisite length of time, significant barriers stand in the way of rights enforcement. There is no labour inspectorate in the UK. And in the absence of trade unions, the sole means of enforcement in the vast majority of cases of breach of the law is via an individual claim before the courts or employment tribunals. But this can come with significant costs for a worker, both economic and emotional or psychological. In low-paid sectors, including care of the elderly and disabled, and hospitality and catering, evidence suggests that minor breaches of employment law are absolutely routine in the UK. In our own study of the hospitality sector, we found that minor breaches of minimum wage law and working time law were so routine as to have become entirely expected by workers and employers alike. Breach of formal legal rules had assumed the status of a social norm, we suggested. Breach had become the custom and practice of the sector. Other studies of different sectors have resulted in similar findings. While government acknowledges that breach is common, it takes no action to make enforcement more effective. We might talk here of deregulation by stealth. The rules exist on paper, but for many, they are simply unenforceable. By reason of the relatively thin substance of employment rights in the UK, especially when viewed in comparison with other European jurisdictions, and by reason too of these difficulties when it comes to enforcement, employment rights are not as significant in practice as we might expect them to be. Together with the weakened nature of trade unions and the sidelining of collective bargaining, this has led me to argue that contract is now the key legal institution in the field of work relations. In comparison to post-war labour law, the role of the contract has expanded very significantly. The contract still performs what we might call the gateway function, of designating parties as employees and employers. In comparison to the post-war decades, however, this gateway function has become more significant. We might even say more politicized. No longer tamed by trade unions, employers have increasingly chosen to draft contracts so that workers do not fall within the legal category employee. Paying clever lawyers large sums of money, no doubt, to assist them with that task. Where that's the case, workers are characterized in law instead as self-employed. This means that employment law doesn't apply, and the employer enjoys consequent savings on wages and other benefits, and also on social security and on taxes. In addition to the gateway function, the contract is now often the primary source of the rules governing the work relation. Labour law today accords individuals a very wide freedom of contract. In practice, this undoubtedly means that a wide freedom is enjoyed by the employer. The employer can draft contracts unilaterally, making workers offers on a take it or leave it basis. That said, it must also be acknowledged that the idea of contract can be attractive to workers too. What we might call the neoliberal liberation of contracting for work from its embeddedness in systems of collective bargaining and employment law can be appealing to workers, at least in some cases. The institutions of the post-war decades and the heavily regulated existence of the Fordist worker may be perceived or portrayed as limiting personal freedom, choice, and flexibility in daily life. In contrast to fixed employment, self-employment or entrepreneurship can seem to hold a promise of freedom. In the highly individualized and commercialized field of work relations today, it is increasingly common for workers to be encouraged to think of themselves as entrepreneurs, owning the job, marketing themselves. In addition to its legal function, allowing platforms to escape employment law and social security obligations, self-employment or entrepreneurship can perform an ideological function, serving to legitimize the expropriation of the workers' employment rights. So this is my last slide where I reflect on the role of labour law in the UK version of neoliberalism, in the neoliberal project, if we can think of it in those terms. How has neoliberalism shaped the development of labour law? And how has labour law influenced the development or unfolding of neoliberalism? An idea central to neoliberalism is that states should play an active role in creating and maintaining free markets. When we look at UK labour law, this idea explains a lot of what we see. It explains the anti-union legislation and the restriction of worker and union freedom to take industrial action. It helps to explain the steps taken to make it more difficult rather than easier to enforce employment rights. And it explains the failure of successive governments to act to address the problem of widespread breach of employment law. But it doesn't explain every feature of labour law today. Labour law has been amended incrementally over the decades. The existing law was never swept away wholesale and replaced with a new comprehensive code. This means that many old rules remain in force, though their significance and meaning may have changed over time. Even where old rules are no longer in force, old ideas about justice and about fairness can persist. Here, I think we ought to bear in mind the Polanyian teaching that in society, there is not only movement, but counter-movement. The unfolding of capitalism is not unidirectional, but structurally conflict-ridden, riven with inconsistencies and contradictions. Workers' claims for justice assert themselves against the structural pressure of markets and competition. How successfully they do so depends on the distribution of economic capital, but also of political power and the outcomes of the ongoing struggle over it. Whatever the limitations of our democracies today, governments and legislatures remain somewhat answerable to the electorate. Democratic pressures may account, at least in part, for the introduction of new employment rights in the Blair years in 2017. In past decades, we must also take into account the role of the courts. The more unlikely pro-worker legislation becomes, the greater the temptation for workers and unions to look to the courts to effect legal change. In past decades, so-called strategic litigation has become more common in the UK and has resulted in some significant court victories. We might mention in passing the 2017 decision of the Supreme Court, which ruled that employment tribunal fees constituted, so charging workers fees to bring a case to the employment tribunal. The court ruled that that constituted a barrier to justice and a contravention of the rule of law. Also from earlier this year, the Uber and Aslam decision of the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that Uber drivers were not self-employed, but they were workers with legal rights to a minimum wage and to paid breaks and holidays. So we see that with movement, there is also counter-movement, markets and state. What of the rule of law? Way back in 1979, Karl Clare wrote about liberal legality and about how claims to law's neutrality, equality, and rationality served to legitimize the legal order. Looking beyond the field of labor law for a moment, we can all probably think of many ways in which law and legal logic have furnished neoliberal reforms with legitimacy. Neoliberal thinkers, including Friedrich Hayek, even prize the rule of law or claim to prize the rule of law above democracy, with certain forms of democracy rejected as sectionalism and collectivism as purportedly undemocratic obstruction to the rule of law. Of course, neoliberals understand the rule of law in a very particular way. For Hayek, the law in the rule of law is very specifically the law of liberty. And the rule of law is therefore the principle of limited government, dictating that government should restrict itself to enforcing rules of just conduct, meaning primarily private property and freedom of contract. It follows that legislation, including especially labor legislation, is seen as an illegitimate contravention of the principle of the rule of law. Despite all the shortcomings of our employment law today in terms of its reach and its enforceability, the provision of basic employment rights continues to create at least the impression of a rule-bound sphere of activity. Interestingly, empirical evidence suggests that workers tend to grossly overestimate the extent to which their interests are protected by the law, at least until a dispute arises and they have reason to seek legal advice. For how long this impression can continue to last in the face of routine breach of the law is another matter. In addition to basic statutory rights, the legal institution of contract also serves a legitimating or ideological function. The notion of being free to negotiate one's own terms and conditions, holds an attraction for at least some workers. Self-employment is more attractive than employment for some, for its inherent promise of flexibility and choice. Closely tied to the ideal of freedom of contract, the idea of market justice is also at play today. Workers may value the opportunity to work hard and get ahead. They might assume that those on very low wages deserve nothing more. They're unskilled, they lack ambition, they're afraid of hard work. Again, workers' own experience of working life and the labour market are likely to shape their own views. So to a brief conclusion. In this neoliberal era, contract is at once the key legal institution in the field of work relations, at least in the UK. And contract is also an ideological lens. The basic direction of travel is towards nominally free markets and state intervention to achieve and maintain those free markets. When it comes to the enforcement of employment rights, non-intervention on the part of the state threatens to undermine the rule of law, at least for as long as we understand the rule of law to require compliance with legislation. Insofar as we are persuaded by the Hayekian definition of the rule of law, we may be satisfied as workers with formal freedom of contract and market justice. But for now, opinion remains divided. The law is inconsistent. Competing ideas of fairness and justice at work exist side by side and can each make themselves heard, influencing the development of the law in different directions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Dukes. Sorry, I was too close. And now we have time for remarks and questions by the audience. Lily and I have remarks and questions, but I think it's a golden rule of panel moderation to give priority to the audience. So if anyone here has a question about the insightful lecture given by Professor Dukes, can join us at the podium and speak. So we would like to listen your comments and your questions and any remarks to this interesting topic, to this very timely topic of labor law and neoliberalism, which I think express itself in different ways in different countries. So you spoke about the UK case, and I will say something about the Italian, but I will wait for anyone else maybe who can bring us another experience of neoliberalism in labor law. So if anyone wants to join us, please come here. So if you are too shy to talk, we will break the ice with Lily remarks. Okay, thank you. Can you join us? And maybe give a little introduction of yourself. Thank you.
Just because nobody takes the floor.
Yeah, thank you.
Honest, and as I work for Belgium, so from a Belgian perspective, I have really a problem with the approach of less rights for workers and this neoliberal tendency, to be honest, in Belgium. strong unions, a lot of social protection, and I don't see any movement and less protection. So my basic thing is, isn't it an Anglo-Saxon view on things, which is of course an important view, but not what's going on in continental Europe. I see my Norwegian colleague over there, maybe he can talk about Norway. I think it's the same thing. We don't see this neoliberal tendency in a major part of Europe. That's maybe an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Norwegian situation. I thought it was interesting to listen to you, and I believe there is a big difference between the systems. What we're talking about in World Employment Confederation, what we're talking about in the World Employment Confederation for the moment is basically more a different wave, especially in continental Europe and in the Nordics, where the focus is more on the unions and more on restricting the labor systems. So my question is, why is it so different between the Anglo-Saxon part of the world? We're not talking about UK, but also United States, Australia, Canada. Why is it so different, the systems you see there, from the systems you see in the Nordics and in Belgium and in France? Because that is the feeling that we get in the situation right now in Norway. We have a new government, and the government is focusing very much on changing labor law, restricting labor law, and obviously in a positive way, you could say parts of it, but of course it's also challenging, because then it's kind of sometimes going too far in the other direction. Thank you.
Do you prefer to collect all the remarks and questions, or you? Okay. Okay.
Thank you both for those questions. Of course, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that the UK is a model for what's happening elsewhere. It was a case study only. And I also can't profess to be expert in the labour laws of all the countries of the European Union. And I won't try to say anything about your jurisdictions that you know so much more about than I do. But I think it is the case that everywhere union membership rates are falling, have been falling, and everywhere the case that the coverage of collective bargaining has contracted, although of course there are big variations between different countries. The UK may well be an outlier in some respect, but you could also perhaps say that the Nordic countries are an outlier in a different set of respects. Why is the UK an outlier? I suppose because of this woman here, because until 1979, the UK was not an outlier. You know, we had, in 1979, we had union membership rates up about 80%, very similar to other EU countries, and very high coverage of collective bargaining and so on. So there was really a break. And that's why I tried to juxtapose the post-war, the 20th century system with what we have now. That's probably all I have to say.
Thank you. Again, my point of view is from the Italian perspective, from the Italian context, but I think it's not so much different from the previous question, because you explained us the central role of contract in the UK context today, and think about also the Italian context, the evolution of labor law and of the doctrinal debate from its origin has been marked by the dichotomy between public and private, between public regulation and the contract. And this contrast has been more recently considered misleading by those who have seen in labor law a specificity. That is precisely the capacity to recompose these two dimensions. Therefore, only by overcoming this opposition, in some way, will it be possible to grasp the nature of labor law as a set of rules of different nature, which have the task not only of redistributing and protecting workers, obviously, but also of regulating competition. In this perspective, labor law obviously finds its founding value in overcoming a liberal conception of work, understood as only as a commodity, but at the same time, labor law concerns the regulation of subjects and method of production. Is there room for a perspective of this kind in the neoliberal era, in your view, or does the risk of legitimizing, as you said, the neoliberal logic prevail? And again, as we saw, does it depend on the strength of labor law institution in each context?
No, so for me, that's still a persuasive explanation of what labor law is. And that's one thing that Wolfgang and I have also emphasized in our work, is the plural sources of the rules that govern work relations. Today still, there is still plural sources, as we've written about in our paper. So I think it's persuasive. And I also think that one of the roles of the scholar is to try to influence these kind of debates and how particular bodies of law are understood. And I think if we can do that, that's an important role to play. So I think it's in the book that I published in 2014, I argued against what was then seemed to be in the UK ever growing tendency to not talk even about labor law anymore, but to talk about labor market regulation. Because I think that the notion of labor market regulation, which is still, it's not necessarily the dominant term within universities, although some scholars use it, but it is the term that you would see in newspapers. Newspapers and governments never talk about labor law or employment law, talk about labor market regulation. And insofar as we do have something like a labour inspectorate in the UK, it is called the Labour Market Enforcement Agency, which doesn't even really make sense, because how do you enforce a market? But they're so scared of using the term labour law that they can't say Labour Law Enforcement Agency, it's the Labour Market Enforcement Agency. So I argued against this tendency because I think that it's too narrow and it misses a lot of what labor law is about. And I prefer your conception, and it's one that I would continue to use with my students and in my own work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if we have other interventions from the audience. If not, I will add some remarks. Again, doing a little bit of comparison between Italy and UK. And listening your lecture, dealing with labor law in the neoliberalism in the UK legal system, the first consideration that came to my mind has been how differently neoliberalism and labor law have been interpreted and conceived in our two legal systems. If I consider my own legal system, the Italian one, the reform that received the label and the huge criticism of being a neoliberal reform has been the so-called Biagi reform of 2003. And this reform had, as one of its founding principles, the idea that it cannot be the law in itself, nor the freedom in the labor market to ensure social justice, and that the adaptation to the reality of the workplaces and of the sector was to be assigned to the social partners and to collective bargaining. So in the Italian case, the move was from statutory law to collective bargaining. And this was interpreted as a form of neoliberalism, as a form of neoliberal power, a power for the employer. So, and the same idea was later purported in 2011 through the habilitation of collective agreements stipulated by more representative trade unions at workplace or local level to derogate the law under certain conditions. The idea was that at that level, at the workplace, at the local level, you can have rules that can be enforced according to the needs of the specific context. So, and even this intervention was highly criticized and was labeled as a neoliberal intervention. So we have two completely different philosophies and both were under this label. And I can explain maybe this huge difference because of the Italian preference for statutory regulation and for non-waivability, to use Guy Davidov's term. But what I'm trying to ask and to figure out is we can agree that this is needed. The intervention of social partners is needed. But on the other side, the criticism raised by the scholars in the Italian context was that social partners, trade unions were too weak to enforce and to use this power they have been given by the legislator. So my question and a little bit of my remark is how can we ensure effectiveness of the intervention of social partners? How can they be those who can reach a settlement between labor and capital in order to join the idea of social justice, an idea of justice, if we have these problems of asymmetries of powers? So speaking from the Italian context, we had a move to collective bargaining, but this move was highly criticized and has been questioned in terms of effectiveness. What do you think about this problem, the problem of effectiveness, and how regulatory techniques, legal techniques can help us overcome this huge problem? I think it's a complex question, but it's something very close to our context. But I think it's
not an easy question. Yeah. It brings to mind a few things. So the first thing it brings to mind is proposals that have been around in the UK just for about, well, around 5 years now, I think. And interestingly, similar proposals have been made in the US. At Harvard University, they have a project called the Clean Slate Project. In the UK, I'm talking about work done by the Institute of Employment Rights. And both groups working separately came up with the same main proposal, which was something, or they put the same thing in the, as a kind of key part of their sets of proposals, which was what we might call sectoral collective bargaining. But what was really meant, because of course in the UK and the US, the trade unions are weak, what was meant is something more like what historically we've called a wages board or a wages council, which is in fact a tripartite body, which has representation of the union, the main unions and the main employers associations in a sector, in hospitality and catering or in care of the elderly, and also has representatives of government. And any collective agreement that this group reaches is then legislated. So it's given the force of law. Now, this has the benefit, of course, that it means the terms are more likely to be enforced because you have the weight of the state, and you can have then various mechanisms of enforcement like a labor inspectorate, like criminal sanctions even, and so on. But what's always often said is the weakness is that it takes the bargaining, the remove between the workers and those who are doing the bargaining becomes greater. And so is it really involving the workers in the decision making if you simply have a few representatives from the main unions and those unions don't have many members? You know, where's the representation in that case? The other thing that came to mind when you were talking, I suppose the reason that the 2011 reforms in Italy were said to be neoliberal was because it was a move from sectoral bargaining to workplace bargaining. Did I understand right? And so I suppose that there is a parallel there with the UK, in that with the UK, the move to contract, it's what, you know, whatever takes you closer to the market, and a move from sectoral level to workplace level takes you closer to the market, and means that, you know, rules don't apply across the board. They don't apply to so many workers. It can also create competition between different workplaces and different groups of workers and so on.
Thank you. So do we have other questions? Let me see what time. Okay, it's 4. So maybe we have to move to the next presentation, then we will have time later on the other part of this plenary session. So maybe we can introduce Professor Streeck, and I will just upload your presentation.
Can I have this little thing here? Okay, here it is. That one?
Yeah.
Okay. Maggie goes out and I come in. Where am I? No. Yeah. And, yes, I'll speak from here. And the format of my presentation is a little bit different. It's always the hard act to follow Ruth when she gives a presentation. So I'll do something slightly different so that you don't compare my performance with her. And the subject is industrial justice in a dynamic and conflictual society. But what I really want to talk about is how one sees labor law as a non-lawyer, as someone who is a sociologist studying the institutions of modern capitalist societies. And then what is it that stands out about labor law? This is interesting insofar as, of course, contract law is a very long heritage of especially European societies going back to Roman law. And it is full of very interesting, but for the outsider, totally unintelligible things like caveat emptor, for example. Yeah, these wonderful things that have been compiled by so many smart people in the 4th century. Labor law is different. And what I want to begin with is to say something on the nature of classical labor law as it arose in especially the 1920s, partly in Germany, partly in Britain, and then sort of spread to many other countries where it was seen as something that was contract law in one sense, but then contract law in a very modified sense, which raises the interest of the sociologists. Now, 4 points. What labor law does is, in the view of a sociologist, an outsider, is that it creates a political regime. It is a constitutional law as much as it is contract law. It sets up a number of organizations in society and action levels and legitimate actors intervening in the action of contract making, which basically results in a very complex organization. And this is because it is not just interested in contract, like old contract law, where the question is simply, are the two parties free to agree? In other words, are they acting under duress or not? And if they are not acting under duress, then the contract is fine and it has to be enforced. Whereas in classical labor law, there's a concern with the justice of contracts, with not just work being exchanged, but decent work becoming the outgrowth of contracting in labor markets. It tries to prevent contracting for indecent work in favor of decent work, makes that distinction, a normative distinction regarding the outcomes of contract making. Moreover, as we touched on in the previous discussion of Ruth's presentation, it is not just state law, it is also social law, law from above and law from below. It opens up the rule-making regime to a number of different influences under the roof of the state, but then allowing, licensing other actors to also have a word and create law, which basically means that dogmatic consistency and pragmatic predictability is not everything. There's also substantive justice involved, and there's the need for participation. So this is a sort of, and I will come back to that subject, it is an impressively open and dynamic system of rulemaking, unlike, for example, classical contract law, where you can go back to a long, long tradition and what has come out of it in civil law in the 19th century. Here, it is not just the lawyer that says something about the law. It is the people who are immediately affected also have a word. It is, in that sense, democratic law from above, from not just from above, but also from below. Third point, labor law is sort of conceivable only if we understand that it happens in a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, work and labor is treated as a commodity with a price. There is a performance that is bought, and then there is a price paid for it. Labor law, however, is not just commercial law, because it recognizes that the commodity that is being traded is an imperfect commodity. Imperfect in the sense that if you sell a car or a banana, then you're done. You go home, watch TV, and you collect the price for the banana or for the car. But if you sell your labor, then you have to sort of come along. The labor it cannot be dissociated from your person. It is not something that you hand over to the employer and then the employer goes home and uses it for whatever purposes. No, you have to be present. And you have to spend a very valuable resource. Some of the 24 hours a day has. There's a living being, so to speak, that wants to sleep and eat and not just work. And the practice of working is immediately related to a social relationship. And that social relationship is one of authority. The employer tells you what he or she expects from you, and you then have to do it, or you are breaching the contract. In other words, it's a very living, a very social, relational thing that we're seeing here, much, much different from the normal commercial contract. Moreover, classical labor law sort of takes into account that when it comes to selling labor, to contracting for work, in that moment, class relations begin to play a role in a capitalist society. By class relations, I mean that capitalist societies, however democratically organized they might be, are basically societies composed of two classes. One class owning capital and the other not owning capital, and all that they can do is sell their labor time. Now, one can even add to this that one of the interesting characteristics of a capitalist society is that it is organized around the production of ever more capital to be invested so that you can add even more capital to already accumulated capital, and that is privately owned capital. Maybe 5% of society own it. The rest have to sort of make a contribution to so that they can become richer by appropriating the capital that you produce in the labor process under the authority of those who own capital. Now that is a very conflictual, basically very conflictual relationship. And the problem of this regime that we call labor law is to make it possible that on top of this very basic conflict, there can be something like productive cooperation between members of these two classes that is considered just in at least some minimal way by everyone, because otherwise it wouldn't work. And that's the very sort of subtle, complex, difficult function that labor law plays in a society. It must make it possible that there is some sort of productive exchange between the two classes that satisfy standards of justice, at least minimal standards of justice, otherwise the cooperation breaks down. I'll say something more on what justice means in this context. Here is the sources of asymmetrical, what I call asymmetrical class power. There are in labor markets, in markets for labor, more workers than employers, and workers have a greater urgency with respect to being employed. You cannot just wait for half a year and eat nothing, because then you're dead. So unless you have some other source of nourishment, what the employer offers you, you have to take. You already see that, for example, social policy and unemployment insurance play a very important part in balancing this relationship. Very importantly, in the organization of, you basically have two venues where regulation, where this regime plays a role: in the market for labor and in the organization of work, the labor process. Labor is a cost factor for the employer. That's very important. He tries to reduce the cost. That is what the employer, he or she, has to do, because they take the so-called residual, that what remains after all the costs, after the production factors have been paid. And the incentive is to make the labor process more productive by innovation, or what Schumpeter calls a new combination of production factors, which means that if you're an employee, your boss may come and may tell you, look, I have this wonderful new typewriter, and please from now on use that typewriter, not the other. And then you suddenly figure out that this is much more productive, and you would like to be paid according to that productivity. And there you already have a little problem with your contract, right? Because the employer is the one who organizes the work, the labor process, not you. So in classical labor law, the assumption is that in order for employment contracts to be fair and its terms just, you have to have collective institutions that make the power distribution between sellers and buyers more equal. Then the more that is the case, and again I come back to how that can be so, then the terms of the contract are seen as minimally just, industrial justice, and there this has sort of two different functions in a society. One is an efficiency function. You want workers to be not really happy, but willing to perform the job that they are being assigned. So they have to have some element of consensus. But you also want in a society that normative ideas of justice are being served at least to some extent. Otherwise, that society becomes an oppressive society at risk of divisive conflict rather than managed conflict. So in order for civilization of labor markets and the work process and for economic efficiency, for these two reasons, you have to have institutions that do something about these asymmetries in class power. Here, in order for, I write all this down because I thought there would be a simultaneous interpreter sitting there to make their lives easier. But it's also for me easier because I can just point to this. So classical labor law provides, in addition to contacts between individuals, also for contacts between collectives. And Ruth has explained this. This is the main idea of classical labor law, of how to not necessarily equalize, but sort of make less stark the power differential between the two classes that meet in the labor market and in the labor process. Introducing collective action in addition to individual action. That is accommodating what is seen as the collectivism of workers into the regulatory regime of the relationship between workers and employers. Yeah, that is such a legal innovation in the 20th century, responding to the contingencies of a capitalist society, that one can really, it's really breathtakingly interesting, at least for an outsider who doesn't start with this thing. It's breathtakingly interesting that our societies were able to invent this sort of, you can say, management process to make it possible that industrial work is not permanent in industrial civil war. So there is an element of state licensing of quasi-public collective intervention in private individual contracting to make this contracting more egalitarian and the results more voluntarily acceptable. Remember classical contract law, where the assumption, the presumption is that it is voluntary to the extent that it is free, and it is free to the extent that there is no obvious pressure, or there's no gun there to the head of the party that signs the contract. But here, the labor law sort of imposes on the process of contracting for work an institution that sort of in a self-regulatory way can find out how voluntary the contract is by inserting collective action into that relationship. That relationship is one, you can also say, of constitutional law. It builds up institutions through which people can be empowered to intervene in the liberal market and regulate that market with respect to its outcomes. Yeah, it's the longer one thinks about it, the more exciting this institutional setup is. Now I come to the issue of industrial justice, or as the International Labour Organization now calls it, decent work. That is a normative issue, and it cannot be settled by economic calculation. So there is no algorithm to determine what is industrial justice and what not. You cannot put it into artificial intelligence machines. It involves human beings who experience their position in labor markets and in the labor process, and who want to be convinced by the process that they are part of, that they are not being, as we say, torn across across the table. They have to see that they are being taken seriously. An element of dignity is also very much involved in industrial relations. The perception that you are not being taken for granted, like a banana you buy in the banana shop, whenever there is the banana shop. So now where on what are the conditions that define what industrial justice is. And there, I think, one has to look empirically, and we will talk about methodology later in this session. That one has to look empirically on a number of things, number of parameters of the work situation in labor markets and in work organizations that involve, for example, technical possibilities. The technology is changing all the time. Is it being used to enhance the profit of the employer? Obviously, yes. But is it also, and can it also be used to enhance the dignity of the worker and the worker's capacity to influence his or her situation? Economic conditions. Markets impose constraints, but they also entail opportunities. And it is the job of entrepreneurs in capitalism to see these opportunities. But in order to exploit the opportunities, they need the help of others. What is the formula where you decide which side gets what? And of course, there is no standard formula. It is a formula that has to be worked out in this constitutional process that is called labor market. The political windows of opportunity, the government changes. That is something that influences what workers perceive as industrial justice. If in the United Kingdom there would have been a Corbyn government, then it would be very likely that many workers would think, comparing to the possibilities that politics might have opened up to them, that the situation in which they have to work is no longer fair, because it now could be different. Yeah, the perception of opportunity is important. The power relations, of course, trade union power raising the level of aspirations of workers. This is why in a neoliberal environment you don't want trade unions, because trade unions go to workers and they tell them it could be different, friends, if you do something about it. Yeah, and what I really want to bring out from the perspective of the social scientists is the normative constructivist aspect of what law and what justice is. It's an interactional process. It is not something that a lawyer can think of. It is sort of conditional on a situation in which many different factors, like, for example, cultural developments and family structures interfere. 30 years ago, it would have been hardly possible to raise the issue of how to make it possible for individuals to combine family life and work. Not only that, how, for example, single parents could manage their responsibilities as family members, as well as their responsibilities as laid down in their contract with their employer. Yeah, and as that arises, discussions can begin on whether our employment structure and our employment law is still fair and just, because it doesn't do justice to these things. In Ruth's work and my work, where we looked at the development of standards of justice as it is anchored in the everyday lives of people, we saw we found that regulating the relationship between working life and family life becomes an overriding concern for a very great number of people, which is new. But the open system of labor law should be able to allow for this to penetrate into the workplace and into regulating the workplace. Very importantly, something that also came up when discussing Ruth's presentation in the question part. How is it possible to monitor and enforce the norms of decent work? And there the answer can only be that even collective bargaining at the sectoral level doesn't help you much unless you have some sort of instant monitoring mechanisms on the ground where work has to be performed. On the ground means at the workplace. In other words, that, however, cannot be done by a state inspectorate. You cannot put a policeman into every workplace. But what you can do is you can have trade union representatives, shop stewards, works councils, who can follow, who are able to follow, and you have a right to follow what happens at the workplace in terms of the implementation of the norms of justice that are of decent work, that are sort of installed at the national or central level, but that need to be actually performed at the workplace. So institution building, which uses the existing social relations among workers, the collectivism of workers at the workplace, in order to enforce the norms that are generated either by collective action or by the state or by the two together in a learning process. And that's another element I want to emphasize. Good labor law is learning law. It is law in a dynamic society. So industrial change, dealing with highly dynamic conditions, technological progress, changing labor supply and demand. And labor supply is also the characteristics of people. In the book that Ruth and I are going to publish, hopefully early next year, we discuss, for example, how intelligent regulation of labor markets can accommodate the obviously growing demand of people for more discretion as to the use of their time, for more flexibility, without handing power over to employers. How can you build flexibility and also entrepreneurialism into the organization of labor markets and work organizations without handing authority to employers, but giving workers also a chance to do it, and without undermining standards of justice. Evolving social structures, giving rise to changing needs of workers with respect to the intersection of work and non-work, work-life balance. And that's what I think is the other fascinating aspect of labor law, that it needs to be living law. Living law that emerges in the interactions of people and then is being perceived, if things work well, by trade unions, courts, governments, that however have in mind the need for fairness and justice, and not just for capital accumulation. So I want to go on to my last point. See, what I also find interesting here is that from the beginning, labor law was in an interesting way both systematic and opportunistic. Opportunistic in the sense that in the 19th century, it was completely clear that a capitalist society could not be governed productively without accommodating the collectivism of workers, the solidarity of workers. It had to be somewhere. You could not suppress it. If you tried to suppress it, you were destroying the entire system. So on the one hand, labor law goes like, yeah, unfortunately, these people will not learn. They won't become individuals. They think their commodity is not a commodity. They want rights, my God, yeah. But then you have to learn, if you do not listen to this, you are asking for disaster. Yeah. Now then you see a lot of what is today called industrial democracy, co-determination and so on, results from the need to accommodate this sort of natural resistance to the commodification of labor power that is inside all of us. And then, of course, politically, the answer is to give to create institutions that not just recognize, but educate this sort of demand. Yeah, tell them that you can do something. So labor law is both normative and realistic, not trying to impose a liberal normative order where it does not fit, where it is rejected by people. And that's why, incidentally, I think that neoliberalization of labor law won't work. And here, the notion of the counter movement that counters the movement, so to speak, is something that needs to be analytically in our mind. It makes no sense to just develop a sort of coherent legal system. In addition to systematic thinking, in particular in this area, you have to think about social movements, about the dynamic of a society, about conflicts, standards of justice, and so on. And these are living; they are not dead. In other words, there is pragmatism and realism, which is absolutely needed to understand the institutions of labor law. It is not enough to deduce them from a general principle of, let's say, contractual equality, like you could if you put together a Roman law on contracts. Yeah. And to come to my conclusion and my most important exhibit, the right to strike. Going on strike is the strongest possible expression available to workers of their sense of justice being violated. Yeah? This is why almost all democratic labor law systems in some way recognize a right to strike. Now, this is sensational in the sense that it is a right to be in breach, to breach a valid contract. More than that, it is a right to prevent the employer from hiring alternatives to continue his or her business. It is a right to be sort of almost violently disruptive. And of course, I remember an account of a strike of mine workers in Wales in the early 20th century, when the relevant minister of Her Majesty's government was one Winston Churchill in his younger years, who noticed publicly that unfortunately, basically these people would have to be locked up because they are sort of causing public all sorts of things. But he said, you can't lock up 10,000 people. And if you lock them up, you don't have coal. And you need the coal that they pull out. Therefore, unfortunately, we have to talk to them. Yes? And I think this in a very nice way encapsulates this sort of pragmatism, realism, if you want, opportunism in a class society that is necessary in order to pacify this society, but not forever, only for the next year. Because you have a settlement now, things change, they always change. In a year from now, you better renegotiate that settlement, because if you stick to it as it is, you will have a surprise. The surprise is that it may not work anymore. So to finish, classical labor law intent on providing for fair contracting and decent work, not just allows workers to breach a valid contract, also prevents employers from hiring replacements, and so on. Realism again, classical labor, because it has no choice and because the right to strike helps balance the power relation between capital and labor. Because this collectivization of the employment contract works only if there is some sort of enforcement. You have to impress these people. An employer is not concerned with necessarily concerned with justice. He or she must be concerned with making a profit so that they can pay off the credit that they have taken up. After all, capitalism has something to do with money and credit, not necessarily with justice. You have to teach them that there is a need not just to make a profit, but also to be nice to people. And in order to be nice to people, you need to allow these people to tell their bosses, look, boss, unless you listen, you'll have a problem. And I think that is a very important central element of labor law. If you forget this, you will easily see this whole complex construct of modern classical labor law drift into the direction of contract law, pure and simple, which will be necessarily oppressive in a class society where the 5% sort of contract with the 95%. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Streeck, for your presentation. So are there any comments, remarks, or questions for Professor Streeck from the audience? Anyone? Okay. Francesco Segezzi.
Thank you for your very interesting and provoking relation. And my question is about some of the changes that we are observing in companies, in industries, especially the great transformation made by technology that has a great acceleration and could increase the distance between workers and employers, because sectors are more vertical than in the past. So each company's, each process has its own features. And sometimes also for workers is more difficult than in the past enter in all this complex mechanism. How this company dimension, in this industrial democracy dimension that you mean, can survive to this mismatch that is increasing, to this distance that is increasing, because sometimes these can be used as a way for by the employer to know more than to own more than in the past the means of production using and so how these can be. I understand that the industrial dimension, the local, the firm dimension is the dimension, because the national dimension is even more difficult in order to understand these problems. But I think maybe also this dimension can be difficult. So how they can manage this issue? Thank you.
This is from what I said, the only thing that directly follows from it is urging labor lawyers or becoming labor lawyers to think of such a problem in terms of how to restore the intention of classical labor law under conditions like this. What sort of institutions would you need in order to fill exactly that gap? And rather than just observing that things are moving in this direction and then be happy to be just a contract lawyer. Yeah. As far as, however, beyond our debate, yeah, these are historical developments which do not follow legal prescriptions, but political power relations. Sometimes it's good to be a little older, which I am, so I can remember the European Union in the 1980s with the so-called Fredeling Directive, named after a Dutch commissioner who was a good old social democrat. And what he wanted was all over the European Union, legal provisions that would make it obligatory for employers to tolerate and even help set up industrial participation mechanisms at the workplace in their organization. Something like co-determination, something like, and this, of course, this was the moment in the early 1980s when the European Union began to go into the wrong direction in this field. I remember these armies of American corporate lawyers flying into Brussels to try to talk the European Commission out of this project. And then they remained in Brussels, incidentally, set up these offices, and there are literally thousands of them still there, watching anything that is happening there in this direction. Now, that was a political moment. Now, I don't want to go down in a pessimistic, desperate mood. So I think if it can go politically in this direction, it might also be go back in the other direction. There's nothing naturally necessary in this, and that means it's a political task. It's interesting that as a labor lawyer, you become immediately involved in the politics of your society. Yeah, and basically from the analysis, you know what is needed. Namely, for example, that technologies are ruled out that are designed to make impossible contact between your workers so that they can collectively deliberate as to whether the terms of their employment are fair or not. Yeah, if you organize a labor process like that, so that you individualize everyone and cut them off from communication with other workers, then that should be illegal. And it should be illegal on the basis of what I have pointed out, the difference between work and decent work, and the difference between just contract and a fair contract, and the difference between a commodity and the imperfect commodity that is human labor. The moment you begin to talk about this, you get into something like a political advocacy role. You have to decide whether you want to do this. But to a large extent, especially if you are a member of the younger generation who will be around for some time, you better do it.
Thank you, Professor. And do we have, okay, thank you. Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, okay, thank you. My name is Ana Teresa Ribeiro. I'm from Portugal.
You're from where?
Portugal.
Ah, Portugal, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Streeck. It was very interesting. And Professor Dukes as well. It was very interesting listening to you. And I will be speaking from the standpoint of my own reality, which is the Portuguese system. And I was listening to you and I was thinking that, well, this is how labor law is supposed to act. But, well, in Portugal, it doesn't really work that way because, for instance, a lot of companies do not enter into collective agreements. So directly, collective bargaining only affects a very small number of employees. So afterwards, the government extends these collective agreements to, to most the employees of a sector. But normally the employees have no idea that these collective agreements exist, that they exist. The employers have no idea which collective agreements are applicable, and sometimes even labor lawyers have no idea which are the agreements that their clients should be applying in a particular situation. So this democratic function of labor law fails in here. The normative function of labor law ends up failing in these situations. And to make matters worse, Professor Duke was talking about the connection of labor law and the rule of law because of the democratic aspect that is behind it. But that means that collective agreements, they should be entered into by representative partners. We don't have any representativeness criteria. So any trade union in Portugal can enter into a collective agreement, and we don't know if they are representative. They can just, I once read a collective agreement that said that it was applicable to one worker. So, and then it was extended to a very larger universe of employees. So we also have that problem. We have trade unions that are representing sometimes very few employees, and then these agreements are extended to a large universe of employees who have no idea of what is going on. And collective agreements can deviate from the law, creating worse conditions. So it is a very dysfunctional sort of system, and I think it jeopardizes this industrial justice that you were talking about. So this is not so much a question, it's more a series of remarks, and thank you very much.
Yeah, you've just listed a political program. Absolutely, I fully agree with you. I think your analysis is absolutely correct. One has to make sure that collective agreements can only be agreements among truly representative unions. That is something that the state can help, but workers also must help. There may be political moments, maybe right now, as you approach an election where you might then have a more leftist government than now. Perhaps not. We don't know. I can only say that 2 years ago, I was riding in a car with someone from your really very left political party who told me enthusiastically how they were governing the Social Democrats from the outside, and the Social Democrats were doing everything that they were telling them. It can't have been like that, according to what you're saying. So try again. Yeah. What else? What we as scholars can do is identify where the problems are, and create an awareness that things need not be the way they are. That something might be able it might possibly be done. Yeah, but apart from that, we're talking politics. Not science.
Do we have other comments and remarks from the audience? Ilaria?
With reference to the answer to the first question that Francesco made, you spoke about an enforcement and an extension of co-determination mechanisms. But my question is still co-determination a valuable instrument in small workplaces where a high flexible workforce operates? And because also I have read data about German co-determination and the number of works councils in these sectors, yes, made up of smaller enterprises and smaller workplaces, which is going down. And something similar also in Italy. We do not have works councils, but we have workers' representatives. And in this small context, it is difficult for trade unions to arrive to be representative. So my question is still co-determination what we need? I think yes, but maybe something different, or I know that maybe is we cannot solve this now, but this is just my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, we're talking about political creativity. If you think about the council systems that now exist, and that, as you rightly say, prove insufficient with respect to all these changes that are going on. These council systems had to be sort of invented, and they didn't fall from the sky. And in Germany, in the Weimar Reichsverfassung of 1919. This great labor lawyer, Hugo Sinsheimer, who was among the people who drafted this particular section in the Constitution. They had a political moment. They had a political idea. They had the power, the skill, the smartness to actually get this on the books. Today, the task is not easier than their task, maybe even more difficult. It does, however, not mean, for example, ADAPT is a place where you might have the resources to actually systematically think about this. How can this be done in a situation like this? And then obviously, economic basic conditions play a very important part. In Italy, you're exposed to the merciless competition in the European monetary system, which makes it very hard for firms to let's say, to make concessions to workers. I know all this, but if I talk about labor law, what can I do? I can only say, if you want to have a civilized workplace, then these and these and these things need to be in place. And if they don't work now, find something that can replace them. And it is not easy.
Thank you, Professor. We are moving to the end of this first part of the session, so we can have just one question or remark if you want, or I will say something if not. Andrea, okay, so I will give you priority.
Okay, thank you very much for your intervention. It was very, very interesting. I am Andrea, and I am working for ADAPT. I was very interested in your concept of industrial justice as a normative issue and an empirical issue as well. And yeah, you know, I am worrying that in realities where unions have still voice and influence, I don't know, maybe large companies with strong industrial relation systems, unions are maybe avoiding this issue in terms of addressing the positioning of political power within the company. So I don't know if it is just something about rules from above. I don't know if it is something about strategies from below, to make industrial justice something more meaningful for today. I don't know, what do you think about it?
Very short answer to this. Absolutely. It is like political moments are moments in which many different things converge. So in this case, social movements are very important, I think, in putting pressure on both employers and unions to clean up the lower end of the labor market. Basically, I have come to the view that nothing happens unless people really indicate that they are fed up with what is going on and that they want some change. And that is not necessarily done on scientific conventions. Yeah, it needs to be done out there, and I really mean this because after all, in a democracy, governments can learn, but they can learn only if they are being told what they have to learn, and then you have to invent a language to speak to them, and that language has something to do with votes. And it has something to do with demonstrations in the street. It has something to do with strikes and so on. In a country like the United States, interestingly, in some areas, it was possible to organize the janitors in in a Californian city, who then started a strike, which effectively improved their working condition and their living condition, because these two things, as I said, are very closely related. Yeah, you need to find some ways, and otherwise nothing is going on.
Thank you again. So maybe we can. Now we're closing this first part of the plenary session. We will be back here in around 10 minutes to start or to continue this conversation, focusing a little bit more on the methodological side. And so we have time till 5:05 to have a little break and then back here to start again. Thank you very much. And thank you again to our guests.
Yeah.
made me cry. You smoked your shoulders in bed. I'm alright. I've been lonely before. I asked for a few kind words. You gave me a nod instead. But I'm alright. I've been lonely before. It's fine. It's okay. It's wrong. Either way. Just wanted to say. It's much fun when we got done. We fell down. Threw my things around. I'm alright. I'm all. I'm sure. So I'm alright, I'm alright. I've been lonely before. We played solitaire in bed. Used to blow bubbles in bed. We sang Christmas songs in bed.
getting sentimental. Shouldn't be looking at those photographs. Time is running fast. I want my heart to have a little rest. And I'm trying hard to face that. Not mine anymore. All your loving now is through that. Let's close our eyes that will not cry. Oh, 'cause now the tide is turning. I know it's up to me. My heart's forever burning. Will burn, but not for you. Getting sad and lonely. You think you're right to burn off photograph. Now what you think of me is made of all the things you couldn't see. Trying hard to face that. You're not mine anymore.
So if you can please take a seat, we will start with our brief second part of the plenary session. So please take your seat. Okay, so we are waiting for the last persons to come here, but we have to start. We have more or less an hour, a little less of an hour. And as anticipated, we will try to talk about methodology, and we will do it starting from the methodological proposal by Professor Streeck and Professor Dukes, who will briefly explain it. But let me first say what is the idea of this second part of the plenary session. As anticipated, the idea was to have a discussion on methodology, which is highly linked to the kind of doctoral school that ADAPT promotes at the University of Siena. So the idea is to let this methodological proposal be put in discussion with what we try to do at our school, which is peculiar for those who do not know, because it is composed mostly by industrial PhDs, so by PhD student and candidate who are working at companies, trade unions, employer organization premises. So their research is, I say on the field, is on spot, on the places, on the workplaces, or on the sectors in the employer organization and in the trade unions. And they are trying to do what Professor Streeck was saying about the empiricism in labor law and living labor law. So they are trying to make labor law live by implementing it at the workplace, sectoral, or at the local level. So this is the idea of our less than an hour. And now I leave the floor to Professor Dukes to introduce, and then we can have an exchange of ideas. So I leave you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you. So I'm going to just say a few very brief words about a paper that Wolfgang and I published last year, I think it was, called Labor Constitutions and Occupational Communities. And I think Wolfgang's remarks earlier, his presentation, he said a lot that's very relevant to questions of methodology. But one thing that really stood out for me, and which I think is at the heart of our paper, is the idea that industrial justice is a normative issue and an empirical issue. While legal expertise is certainly very important, what we would strongly argue against is the notion that labor law and industrial justice are somehow technocratic matters that can be solved by experts sitting in ivory towers. So we begin our paper from an understanding of collective bargaining as a process through which workers' ideas about what is just and what is fair in any given context also come to shape the rules that govern their working lives and their work relations, in addition to the employer's interests. So it's the employer's interests and the workers' ideas coming, both shaping the rule formation. As collective bargaining has been sidelined in some countries more than in others, but nonetheless sidelined to some extent everywhere. And as statutory law has become, at least for some sections of the workforce, more important than collective agreements, the focus of legal scholars has shifted or shifts to the legislature and to the courts and away from collective bargaining. If insofar as legal scholars also pay attention to questions of enforcement as well as interpretation of the law, they might also think about the actions of firms and other kinds of employing organization as the actors to whom labor law, statutory labor law, is directed. These are the regulated parties, and we can think of the state then as the regulator. If our focus is only with the legislature and the courts, and maybe to an extent with firms and employing organizations, then workers kind of drop out the picture. And we don't, as legal scholars, think so much anymore, or we don't even question what workers' shared ideas of justice are. This is a mistake, Wolfgang and I argue, because we say, even in situations where collective bargaining has been sidelined and statutory rules are on the face of it the primary source of regulation of work relations, workers' shared ideas of justice remain highly relevant to an understanding of labour law and of regulation of work relations. One reason for this is that workers' shared ideas about justice and their shared practices at work can crystallize or concretize over time into social norms. So actual rules, which have even possibly some kind of sanctions attached, social sanctions attached if they are breached. Social norms and shared ideas of justice interact in various complex ways with formal legal rules. But from what Wolfgang's already said, it's clear that social norms and shared ideas of justice are highly relevant to questions of social stability and to questions of enforcement of formal legal rules, because enforcement, the onus to take action to enforce legal rules often lies with workers or with trade unions. And if they understand, if the gap between social norms, shared ideas of justice and formal legal rules becomes significant, then it's highly unlikely that workers and unions will take the necessary action to enforce the legal rules. So because we believe that workers' shared ideas of justice are still very important, the question then arose how to study those today in situations where union membership is very low and there aren't kind of formal mechanisms for worker representation. And our argument here is that if there are no unions and formal methods of worker representation, formal mechanisms for worker representation, we can look nonetheless at groups of workers. And then we drew on a term from sociology from the 1950s, occupational communities. And an occupational community, according to that literature, is a group of workers who work together and who also undertake activities outside of work together. So they socialize together, or maybe their families interact with each other. And through the workplace interaction and the out of work interaction, close relations, social relations are built up, relations of solidarity even perhaps, and it becomes possible for shared ideas of justice, of fairness to evolve, and as I say, to concretize or crystallize into something a bit more than just shared ideas of justice, something more like a social norm. So that's the basic idea within the paper. That's the basic method within the paper. We didn't do our own empirical research in order to write that paper. We did rather a review of the existing literature on occupational communities. And from that literature, we drew various conclusions, including, importantly, the conclusion that even in fissured, I think the word fissuring was used earlier, even in the fissured workplaces of today and in situations where work has been organized so that the work is being done by, it's very individualized and workers are very isolated. Think of the platform economy, the gig economy. Even in these kinds of situations, occupational communities can develop. So for example, bicycle couriers, it's highly individualized, they're competing against each other for the work, but various studies have shown that in some cases, bicycle couriers have found physical locations where they congregate to wait for, the next task, the next thing to ping in on their phone. And so they do build up these communities and So these can still be studied today, and in some circumstances, occupational communities can become kind of foundations for worker solidarity and possibly for more formalized kinds of worker representation.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation of the main contents of your methodological proposal. So yes, please.
I think what we really want to bring out is that scientific or social scientific methodology on the one hand and practical organizing activities are not totally disjunct. They can overlap. We know of research projects where one brings people together to discuss things in a discussion group, and it is simply a focus group initially where you try to find out what these people think. But then the experience of the focus group leaves an impression on them that it is useful to talk to the people who are in similar or the same conditions in the labor market. And then it may even result in, as you said, joint meeting places where people usually come together. Coming together is absolutely essential for two things. It is essential for collective action, because you cannot have collective action if you don't see the warm bodies of the other person. That is not possible. At the same time, it is also necessary for finding out what your real interests are, because in an individualized situation, you may not be able to actually, you may not have the time, you may not have the support to think about something. So the very sort of process of coming together can be a process of enlightenment. People can begin to learn something from others, and therefore even the existence of an occupational community, which we can observe in as sort of facts, people do congregate, can be helped forward by bringing people together as an organizer and as a social scientist, and as this combination of social scientist and organizer. And then you suddenly see that people who at the beginning were completely undemanding as to what they wanted because they were shy or they had not learned to raise their voice, suddenly by meeting others and being encouraged to talk about their lives and what is missing in their lives, they are beginning to develop something like an articulated interest. And these are learning processes that are research processes at the same time, because you do not know at the beginning what people will actually define as their collective will. That is the result of a process. And in that sense, methodology of research and the method of organizing can hang closely together.
Thank you very much, Professor Streeck, for these insights. Because we are discussing with Emanuele just now that really what you said really explain also the idea and the sense, let me say, of the research projects and activities that we are trying to support and promote inside our school. And that is also this is also the reason why we found your paper and your proposal so important and interesting for research in labor law and for labor studies more in general, because there's an attempt to create a connection between concepts and categories coming from different disciplinary fields and from different worlds, as Professor Streeck explained, which perfectly fit with our idea of what a modern researcher should be. And that is why we had a very deep discussion in our school about your proposal, and we so now it's time to invite and to suggest to our audience, and in particular to our PhD students to take the floor and ask questions and make remarks concerning these interesting proposals and professors' insights. So, anyone want to take the floor and make remarks and questions? I'm sure they are.
So please don't be shy. We have discussed this in our. Okay, thank you. So it was analyzed and discussed at our school. So maybe there will be something more than remarks and some insights from the reading. Then, okay.
Sorry, just one remark more. We also tried to suggest to put the reflection, let me say, inside their experience of research and work.
Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am a PhD student, so thank you very much. So my question is about your methodological paper. And you have stressed out in it the point of the plurality of the juridical systems. So in your paper, you have underlined this distinction between social norms and juridical norms. And as I have understood, so maybe I'm wrong, in occupational communities, which can be seen as juridical systems inside the state, but distinguished from the state, norms that arises in the institution is a social norm. So to be transformed in juridical norm, it needs to the intervention of the state. But another thing is to affirm the full juridical strength of that norm that arises from occupational communities, according to the institutional theory. So to affirm that the occupational communities can produce directly juridical norms. So I have two questions. The first, the combination and the aggregation of workers is only a social factor, or can it be also seen as a juridical element? And the second question is also about the role of the positive law. So my question is about the intervention of the state. So is there a real need to confer juridical status to the norm that was born in occupational communities, or is it already a juridical norm? So thank you very much.
So just a brief explanation of the questions, which are very theoretical. These questions are indebted to Santi Romano, who was an Italian scholar who proposed the idea of the plurality of the legal systems, and then it was translated in labor law, particularly by Gino Giugni. So she was studying this, and that's why she's bringing this to the table.
Oh, it's a very interesting question. I think the answer partly depends, of course, on how you define law. And different scholars take very different approaches to how one defines law. So a sociologist like Eugen Ehrlich, writing way back at the beginning of the 20th century, he would have said that no state intervention was necessary, or even, no prior state acknowledgement of the lawmaking power of the group would be necessary, because what was at issue for him was whether law was living law, and for him living law was the rules that were actually followed by a particular social group. For me, I prefer to have a clearer distinction between what is a social norm and what is a formal legal rule, but that's probably because I have a legal training rather than a sociological one. And another sociologist whose work is of interest here, an American who we've done work on recently, is Philip Selznick. And when he looked at the emergence of social norms, or the development of social norms in work or within organizations, writing in 1969, he used a term incipient law, which means law that is in the process of becoming. And he spoke about how the demands of a group or the shared beliefs of a group can become kind of so urgent that they must be recognized as law. And there's different ways in which that can happen, of course. And as I said right at the beginnings of my remarks, we understand collective bargaining. Labor lawyers would usually understand collective bargaining as a way through which social norms can become formal legal rules.
Yeah, and maybe I can add one more perspective to this, which is in our work, it became clear to me that one can sort of theoretically systematize the interaction between law on the books and the, let's say, communal sentiments of justice that turn into norms. Yeah, and very often I've become convinced that for people to decide what is their right, they can look at the formal law and then begin to think from there. And then they come up with, yeah, that should be really taken seriously, or there should be some more of this. Whereas at the same time, the legislator will look at the sentiments of people as to what justice is. And if the legislator tries in a democratic society not to violate these sentiments, then this is another direction of the interaction between the two. So the sharp disjuncture between the two is probably not the right way of thinking about it. It could be a process of mutual sort of influence, which, however, maintains let's say, the different ontological status of law made by the legislature and communal norms arising in a group. For example, one of these famous studies of occupational communities, the one by Samuel Martin Lipset and others on the printers in New York in the 1950s, they sort of say very clearly that one of the norms of this group is that no manager is ever allowed to enter the shop floor of the print shop. So if you were the manager of this newspaper and you try to get into, they would say, out here, disappear. We don't want to see you, we don't want to hear you, we do our things. This is very hard to translate into formal law. Yeah, but no manager in his right mind would not respect this, because on the condition they knew that these people had this sort of professional ambition to do the best possible job. And in the next day have a New York Times out, which is perfectly nicely printed. Yeah, and this interaction between sort of the power to set norms and the willingness to be a professional printer, yeah, which justifies why these people are not allowed to come in, because they would interfere with a job that they don't understand. Yeah, if you unlock these various understandings that go into such a norm, then you see, first of all, how it arises out of the labor process, and on the other hand, why it is so powerful, even though it cannot become formal law. In fact, if the manager would address, would refer to the law of the land in the United States, then that particular print shop is owned by his firm, and after all, he can go in. But if he does, he interferes with the process on which he depends and of which he knows it will be done in a perfect way, especially if I stay away from it. Yes, and these complex interactions are what a sociologist is fascinated with. But what I also suggest that lawyers, in order to overcome a rigid distinction between law and the books, on the books and living law, should be aware of. Yes.
Thank you. So do we have other remarks and questions? Okay, we have two. Is Matteo? Okay, you can start. And then Lorenzo. And if anyone else from the audience wants to add anything to our discussion is more than welcome. Thank you, Matteo.
Hello, my name is Matteo. I've just completed a PhD about the history of apprenticeship and the link between apprenticeship, trade union, and workers' representation. So, about occupational communities. In your paper, you refer as an example to the craft unions. And the craft unions in the past, of course, in the industrial society, used the apprenticeship as a tool useful to build up the communities. To build up, of course, a regulation of the work, wage setting, of course, but also in order to transfer knowledge between generations and to share values between workers. So, thinking about occupational communities now in our society, what do you think about apprenticeship? Do you think that this could be a useful tool in order to build up these occupational communities, or is just a tool from the past and there are more useful tools that today can be used in order to attract young people and to make young people enter these occupational communities? Thank you.
First of all, I'm very happy that you're working on apprenticeship. This is something that has fascinated me all my life and been absolutely fascinating thing. And within printers, it's even more fascinating, because if you know the printing industries in different countries, they no longer exist, as we know, due to technological change. The fascinating thing was that in all countries that I knew, regardless of their local law of freedom of association, there was never freedom of association in a print shop. And for the apprentice, passing their examination for a skilled worker and getting the union card was absolutely the same moment in the United States, in Germany, in Britain, in wherever, in France even, where unions were, where this sort of thing was completely illegal. Yeah, they're everywhere. So now you're asking, is there something that one can learn from this experience? I do think that there is, and the little things that I've read on IT specialists, people who run these formidable computer centers, and who work there as programmers, they also are able to move from one place to the other because they have a general knowledge. They learn that knowledge by observing what others are doing, because there's a lot of sort of intuition involved in debugging, for example, a program. And I could think that the moment would come when they would get together and set up sort of standards of decent work for themselves, so that they do no longer have to work in an emergency like 24 hours in a row. Whenever you see sort of this combination of professionalism, learning by doing, and a need to, in a new industry, to impose some sort of order on their working life, then I think there is a possibility. Now, that does not necessarily have to become a trade union of the printers version, but it could be a professional association. In our work that is about to be published, we argue that we now have to look back to the 19th century, where the independent craftsmen sort of set up something like, small business associations. And small business associations can also be very important representatives of communal norms and common interests and producers of regulation for a particular occupational group. To me, the very important bit of information from the British scene in the 19th century was that for a long time, craft unions in important industries did not distinguish between wages and prices. So they made lists like the price for completing something, one page of print, is so and so many cents, yeah, not wage. If you ask for a price, then you are basically a how do you say, a small business person, yeah. But they organized because they knew that as small business persons, they would be in a very difficult situation if they were individuals, yeah. And there you have to sort of relax the distinction between unions and independent associations of small business.
Okay, so Lorenzo, if you want to join us, and then I'm pretty sure also Lily will have something to say, maybe because she is working on this and she worked a lot on this.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Lorenzo. I'm a PhD student, and I'm doing an internship in a research foundation in Milan, which cares about life science. And during my internship, I have the opportunity to see growing an original occupational community, the researchers' occupational community, with their social norms made by employees, executives, PhDs, postdocs, internship students, and so on. And these communities goes further the type of contracts and the rule of labor law. Researchers are united to claim the best possible conditions for research, and of course, for their research projects. And so my question from my experience is how we can rethink nowadays the representation in contexts and workplaces where there are temporary occupational communities, for example, researchers, and where we can find different types of work contracts and social norms that go further the borders of classical labor law and trade union law.
Thank you. Your research sounds really fascinating. Of course, occupational community building is more difficult in certain circumstances. And one of the circumstances in which it becomes difficult is where the workers in that particular workplace are, or doing that job, if there isn't a workplace, are only working there temporarily, and there's a high turnover, and so these relations don't build up very easily. So we don't really kind of address that with any kind of normative solution in the paper. We just note that it's more difficult in different places. What we do say is the point that Wolfgang made in his presentation, is that where the work has been organized with the intention or with the effect of making social relations between workers difficult or impossible, then perhaps that's, you know, a case can be made for the law to step in and prevent that kind of work organization. So we don't make it's not the kind of paper where we're making really detailed proposals for law reform. But one thing that we do say, for example, is that if we were to rethink what freedom of association means today, and how the principle of freedom of association can be made meaningful for workers today, then one thing we would note is that very precarious working relations should be understood to contravene the principle of freedom of association. Because if you can lose your job very easily, if you have no protection against dismissal, then that's a real barrier to any kind of realistic collective action. And another point we make is that work to give freedom of association effect, employers should have to provide for the possibility for social relations between the workers. For example, if workers are working online or otherwise remotely, then it should be a duty on the employer to create some kind of digital space for social relations between workers.
Yeah, the point is that sociability between workers can be recognized as a productive force. Yeah, that is an ambivalent concept in the sense that it can be sort of occupied by the employer and turned into a tool of exploitation. Yeah, But that is always the case with worker associations. Employers can try to penetrate them and turn them into managerial tools. Yeah, but in order to prevent this, you first of all, however, need the opportunity to organize. And so any, as Ruth says, if you employ workers, you should have let's say, you should have the obligation to allow for discourse among workers to take place on what the best productive situation for themselves is, and then try to find a compromise with this, because it always involves a compromise. In a capitalist society where you depend on cross-class cooperation, no class can impose its conditions on the other class. But that means that in order for production to be possible, you need a compromise. In order to have a compromise, you need mechanisms, institutions to make that compromise possible. Otherwise, it turns into a dictatorship. And there, you could say, from a constitutional perspective, you don't want a dictatorship in politics, and you don't want a dictatorship in work, in industry, which is the second. See, one thing that let me just inject in today's discussion on what a democracy is, a subject that played a very important role well into the 1980s is totally disappeared. That is that in a democracy you have parliamentary democracy, but you also have industrial democracy. In a few decades ago, the idea that a Western capitalist society could function without trade unions and collective bargaining as a second tier of government under the government of the state would have considered completely weird. Yeah. So this memory can be revived in terms of giving workers an opportunity to first explore together what their interests are and not deprive them of voice. Voice is central to democracy, and a constitutional democracy has the obligation to provide opportunities for the articulation of voice. And my view, optimistic views, it will happen. People like these programmers or people like others will at some point discover that individually, as individual artists, as soloists, they are lost in the relationship with these big firms. And then they will ask for opportunities to define their collective interests.
Thank you. I will take the chance because I've been really stimulated by this paper, probably because of my sociological background. Then I turned to labor law, so I'm the perfect, let's say, audience for this kind of reasoning. I will just provide an example from let's say, a not so recent legislative intervention here in Italy concerning the non-regulated professions. And let's say those professions who are not regulated by law in different way, are not inside the professional, are not registered or organized in bar association. This law is the law number 4 of 2013. Aims at regulating the market of these new professions and at protecting consumers, first of all, and then introduces some, let's say, measures concerning professional qualifications and recognitions of these professionals. So a first interesting normative data is the field of application of the law, because the law applies to both independent professionals and those who perform the same activities in an employment contract, and also to when professional activity is organized in associative or cooperative forms and so on. The law aims at creating a transparent market with a strong role for professional association, because a great part of the law is devoted to the regulation of professional associations, their scope, their functions, their prerogatives, and so on. The law assigns to professional association the role to control and manage this market by setting the rules for quality assessment and the standards for qualifications. So here I saw a procedural function of law that you mentioned in your proposal, because the legislator does not intervene directly in regulating the market, but assigns to professional associations this task. And also probably an example of how it is possible to regulate the emergence of occupational communities, the so-called new professions, let me say. And probably we can also see an attempt to promote and support different collective interests, based in this specific case on professional recognition, for example. The law has been almost ignored by labor law scholars. Sociologists have been a little more interested in it. And a number of questions arise. Is the regulation of these professional markets a matter of labor law? Or are we just talking about protecting consumers? Are these professional associations relevant for labor law? Are they union or not? So the question is, are those kinds of questions relevant for the Weberian sociology of law that you are proposing to support and stimulate, or for labor law itself?
Yeah, she's the expert.
No, it sounds very interesting, and it sounds absolutely like labor law. I suppose one of the things that has happened since the post-war decades, as work relations have become more commercialized, more fissured, more diverse, is that the boundaries of what labor law is have become more blurred. But it seems clear that even if the primary purpose is to protect consumers, there is regulation of work relations happening here. And so it is certainly of interest to labor law. And I think I agree with you from what you said, that it fits with our idea of procedural law from the government, from the state, which is facilitating the creation of occupational communities. So it would be a very interesting case study to study empirically, by the sound of it.
Yeah, and I allow myself to suggest a piece that I wrote together with Philipp Schmitter a long time ago, with the title "Markets, States, Communities, and Associations?" ? Yeah, where we try to define a space in the political life of advanced democracies where associations can make an important contribution as a source of ordering social relations. Yeah, and much of what I hear is now a discussion. Shall we just focus on trade unions, or shall we subsume trade unions under associations, in the sense that they are a modus of social, let's say, rule-making, where people equals, like workers in particular. And state is like authority and citizen. Markets is like buyer and seller. Communities are people who like each other. Yeah. Whereas associations do not necessarily have to like each other. You are in the same sort of bracket in a society. And from this, there could be both common interests as well as common capacities or joint capacities to make a contribution to the social order generally by ordering your field. The apprenticeship was mentioned. For me, apprenticeship was always an example of how associations of small business, essentially in Germany, were charged with a task which was important for them to have good next generation of workers, and for society as a whole to make sure that young people sort of find a way where they can seriously learn to work in a demanding or more or less demanding occupation. acquire skills, social relations, work habits that allow them later to set up their own small business. Yeah? Then this is sort of something self-serving, but also other-serving. And without this combination, it is hard to think about these intermediary organizations because they have to sell something to their members. But in order to be instituted by society, they also have to make a service, to provide a service to society as a whole. And this cannot be just laid down forever what this is, but there needs to be a negotiation process, both between the organization and its members, and between the organization and what Schmidt and I call its influence environment, yeah? where you derive influence, but also deliver something in return. And so maybe this concept of association building may be a sort of good. It was it was pre-neoliberal, and now maybe post-neoliberal. It may gain some new traction.
Thank you very much. Yes.
So we have to close the plenary session of this afternoon. I want to thank Professor Streeck and Professor Dukes. Maybe we can give them. Now I ask Margherita if she can join us to give some info. We can go.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick information for tomorrow. The second plenary session will be held here, so in this conference room at 5 p.m. So I kindly ask you to join our attendance at the our colleagues here at 45 p.m. in order to be duly in time for the COVID passport check. And for speakers who registered for the social program of tomorrow morning, the meeting is at Piazzale Sant'Agostino, which is in the upper town of Bergamo. You can easily reach the meeting place with the bus number 1A, or by feet is about 10 minutes walk. So see you tomorrow, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Getting sentimental, shouldn't be looking at those photos.